Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's history class. I am absolutely thrilled to have you all here because, well, today we're diving into one of the most tense, dramatic, and literally world-shaping eras of the 20th century. We're talking about the Cold War. This was a monumental 44-year geopolitical chess match that ran from 1947 right up until 1991. If you've ever looked at a modern map and wondered why the borders look the way they do, or why humanity raced to land on the moon, the answers are all waiting for us right here in this explainer. Here's our game plan for today's class. First, we'll establish our baseline with the silent global conflict. Next, we're unpacking the core philosophical differences in democracy versus communism. Then we'll trace the real-world impacts through crises and proxy wars, before we launch into the incredible space and arms race. And finally, we wrap it all up with the wall comes down. So let's get right to it. Section 1. The silent global conflict. Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to imagine a war lasting nearly half a century, consuming the entire globe's attention and resources, right? But here's the catch. The two main enemies never actually fire a single bullet directly at one another. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what the Cold War was. It was a period of intense political, economic, and military competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, but noticeably, without direct, major warfare. We call it cold because the geopolitical temperature was deliberately kept from boiling over into a hot, large-scale fight between the two superpowers. But make no mistake, the rivalry was fierce, the tension was absolutely through the roof, and the stakes, literally total global survival. Section 2. Democracy versus communism. So what actually caused this massive global standoff to begin with? To really grasp the Cold War, you have to understand that this wasn't just your traditional fight over land borders or natural resources. No, we had two global heavyweights with completely fundamentally opposing worldviews. On one side, you have the United States championing democracy and capitalism, a system built on free markets, private property, and individual political choice. On the exact opposite side, the Soviet Union stood for communism, a system prioritizing state control, collective ownership, and a single-party government. Both of these superpowers desperately wanted to spread their own systems across the globe. They both firmly believed that their way was the absolute best path forward for the future of humanity. And honestly, they viewed the other system as a massive existential threat. Moving on to Section 3, Crises and Proxy Wars. You just can't have that much intense ideological pressure building up globally without a release valve. The tension has to go somewhere. So while they didn't fight directly, they absolutely fought indirectly through devastating what we call proxy wars. For example, in 1948, during the Berlin blockade, the Soviet Union essentially tried to starve out Western Berlin by completely blocking all railway, road, and canal access to the sectors under Western control. Then, this ideological struggle spilled over into massive, tragic conflicts like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. In these regions, the US and the USSR backed opposing local sides with money, weapons, and troops. They essentially turned regional disputes into devastating real-world battlegrounds. And then, the tension absolutely peaks. It's 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 agonizing days, the entire world completely held its breath. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a terrifying political and military standoff over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on the island of Cuba. And Cuba's sitting just 90 miles from U.S. shores. It was, without a shadow of a doubt, the absolute closest humanity has ever come to an apocalyptic nuclear war. The survival of the human race was quite literally hanging by a thread. All right, Section 4, Space and Arms Race. Let's take a collective breath and shift gears for a second, because this conflict wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was fought in laboratories, in factories, and remarkably, up in the stars. The competition of technology and human achievement during this era was nothing short of mind-blowing. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the Soviet Union actually struck first in this arena. They successfully launched Sputnik 1, the very first artificial satellite, into orbit. And let me tell you, it was a massive psychological shock to the West. But the United States responded with an audacious, almost impossible goal, ultimately making unparalleled history with the Apollo 11 mission by landing the first human beings on the moon. It was just a magnificent, high-stakes race for ultimate technological and ideological supremacy. However, right alongside that awe-inspiring space exploration, there was a much darker and deeply terrifying competition happening back on the ground, a massive buildup of nuclear weapons. To protect their global interests and deter attacks, both sides formed massive, heavily armed military alliances. The United States and its Western allies formed NATO, while the Soviet Union and its affiliated communist nations responded by creating the Warsaw Pact. So the globe was effectively split straight down the middle into two deeply suspicious camps, just constantly glaring at each other across the divide. Let's move to Section 5 and see how this builds to the end of an era. The wall comes down. After decades of this immense, exhausting tension, the profound cracks in the system finally started to show. We survived the early tension of the Berlin blockade. We made it through the world-ending terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But jump ahead with me to 1989. In a series of peaceful revolutions, the world watched in absolute awe as the Berlin Wall, which was the ultimate, most visible physical symbol of this whole Cold War division, finally fell. Families that had been separated for decades were suddenly reunited. The metaphorical Iron Curtain began to lift. And just 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved into independent republics. That officially brought this monumental 44-year era to a definitive end. As we wrap up today's class, I want you to remember that the Cold War wasn't just some chapter in a textbook that neatly closed in 1991. Not at all. It fundamentally shaped the modern political borders and global alliances we see today. It pushed science and technology to limits no one thought possible back then. I mean, it drove innovations that gave us modern satellites, global telecommunications, and the modern space program. It completely redefined international relations, establishing the incredibly complex geopolitical landscape that world leaders are still navigating right this very minute. Which brings me to my final and probably most important thought for you all today. I want you to look at a map of the world right now. Look at your daily news headlines. How are the historical shadows of the Cold War still shaping current global politics in countries today? Keep that deeply provocative question in your minds as you continue to study history and current events. The echoes of this era are truly everywhere if you just know where to look. Thank you all so much for joining the class and for your excellent attention today. Stay curious, keep studying your history, and I'll see you all next time.